Dumelang. Welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Clement Manyatela. Great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, how should South Africa respond to the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act that's seeking to review US-South Africa relations and potentially impose sanctions on senior ANC officials? The bill has progressed from the Foreign Affairs Committee to the House. So how do we respond? And should we even respond? The former ambassador to the US, Ebrahim Rasool, joins us tonight. Also, how concerned is the ANC about the potential for the party's leaders to be sanctioned? Mahlengi Bhengu-Motsiri is the ANC national spokesperson who will also speak to us on that issue. Also on the show, how will the KZN Premier respond? Two of his MECs are facing serious allegations of misconduct. The MEC for Education and the MEC for Health are accused of personal enrichment and misuse of public funds. We speak to the KZN Premier Thamsanqa Ntuli. And then later, the former Minister Roelf Meyer speaks to us about the national dialogue and other issues. He has been appointed by the President to co-chair that dialogue. But first, my comment. So yesterday we saw developments around the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. That bill that could review US-South Africa relations and potentially impose sanctions on senior ANC officials. So the bill has cleared its first legislative hurdle when it was passed by the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Tuesday in a 34-16 vote, but it still has a long way to go. But the fact that the bill was elevated from committee to Congress is an important development. It's now advanced basically from committee to Congress. And this is a bill that directs the US government to re-evaluate diplomatic trade and military ties with South Africa, citing Pretoria's recent engagements with global powers such as Russia, China and Iran, as well as its controversial interactions with Hamas. That's what they say. It also seeks to identify South African government officials and ANC leaders eligible for sanctions. Congressman Ronnie Jackson accused South Africa of abandoning America and its allies.
South Africa has enjoyed a rich partnership with the United States, particularly in terms of trade, counterterrorism cooperation, and global health. Recently, however, South Africa has abandoned America and our allies and increasingly aligned itself with our adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, and Iranian military proxies like Hamas. My bill, the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act, will provide the President and the Secretary of State with the tools needed to conduct a full review of the U.S.-South Africa bilateral relationship and determine whether South Africa has engaged in activities that undermine United States national security or foreign policy interest. In addition, my bill will give the Trump administration the authorities needed to identify and sanction corrupt officials of the ANC and continue to align with China, Iran, Russia, and have abandoned the United States in the process.
And the question is, who is Ronnie Jackson? And we'll find out when we speak to the former ambassador to the US about what his interests are and who are the people that are backing him to be pushing for a bill like this. The committee chairman, Brian Must, says the ANC's direct engagement with Hamas leaders and the country's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice are further proof of worsening relations between South Africa and the US.
This is a targeted and overdue response to troubling shifts in South Africa's foreign policy under the African National Congress. Let me be clear that this bill is not anti-South Africa, it is pro-accountability. For too long, we've watched a key partner drift closer to authoritarian regimes, conducting joint military drills with Russia, strengthening economic and cybersecurity ties with the Kremlin and Beijing, and aligning with efforts to de-dollarize the global economy. These actions raise serious questions about the ANC's alignment with the democratic values and U.S. interests.
But not everyone was in support of this bill.
South Africa acts as a leader not only among African countries, but also on the world stage. As we have seen this year with the country's G20 presidency, we have a long history of partnership between our countries that I hope to see continue in the future, including with a successful handover as the United States assumes the G20 presidency next year. Unfortunately, this bill will not help to deepen or further that partnership. Instead, I believe it sets us down the wrong path with respect to our relationship with South Africa. South Africa has taken a number of foreign policy positions that I happen not to agree with. But in mature relations between countries, we can deal with those differences through diplomacy and dialogue. This legislation does just the opposite.
Now, the House will now vote on this bill. If it passes in the House, it goes to the Senate. If it passes the Senate after intense debate, it then goes to the US President for his signature. But there are still questions about whether it has broad bipartisan support. I mean, the question, though, is where is South Africa in all of this? The only people that are talking seem to be the ones who want the bill to be passed. It looks like there's a communications vacuum here on the part of South Africa. Where is our investor envoy, Mcebisi Jonas? Isn't this the crucial time to be on the ground in Washington, D.C.? I mean, we have 30% tariffs that are coming come the 1st of August, and now this. Oh, should we just give up on trying to fight and accept that the relations with the U.S. are broken? And what would that actually mean? President Cyril Ramaphosa had this to say about those developments.
We've heard about what has happened in a House committee, and that whole process still has a long way to go, and discussions will be ongoing, and we don't know exactly what is driving all this, and our bilateral dealings and engagements with the United States will continue, and we will talk about all manner of things, including precisely this issue and many others. We've got good diplomatic relations with the US, and we want to enrich them and make them better. So we're very positive that the outcomes of our engagement with the United States will be comprehensive and all-encompassing so that we can return to good dealings with the United States.
Now, here's the question we're asking you tonight. How should South Africa respond to this bill as it heads to the House of Representatives? Should we just give up and acknowledge that the relations with the US are broken? Do we wait it out? What do we do? You can send us a WhatsApp voice note on 078-459-1897. Share your thoughts with us. Remember to tell us your name and surname and where you're sending that voice note from. And please keep it at 30 seconds. Alternatively, you can send us an X on @FaceTheNation SABC. All right, let's speak to the former South Africa's ambassador to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool. Thank you so much for making time for us, Mr. Rasool. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
So from what you understand about processes in the US and as far as lawmaking is concerned, is it a big deal that this bill has now progressed from the committee to the House?
Look, I think it is a big deal. I think the costs could be enormous. I think that we have had many steps taken against South Africa. I think sometimes we forget that PEPFAR has ended. Sometimes we forget that all the USAID money that came to South Africa was ended, that we've been punished through the World Health Organization, the JETP, all of those kind of things have happened. And basically, I think we now also have the 30% tariffs plus the possibility of 10% because of our BRICS membership. Yeah. So this is another step, and possibly just not the heaviest of steps that can be taken, but symbolically, I think it is particularly pernicious that this is being done. And it was no irony that you had two white Congress members making the case and Representative Meeks, a black Congress member, pushing back on it. And so I think that that says a lot about what is going on and what is taking root in the USA against South Africa.
So Republicans control the House and the Senate, albeit with a narrow majority. What are the chances that this will go through, given the sentiment in Washington, D.C.? Is there broad bipartisan support from what you've observed so far?
I think that from what I know is that there are even Democrats who feel uncomfortable with some of South Africa's foreign policy positions. There are Democrats who did not like the fact that we took Israel to the ICJ for genocide and that we are part of BRICS and all of those kind of things. But I think that many of them would not go as far as to want South Africa and the ANC leaders sanctioned to that extent, and still see South Africa as very influential in Africa, very important in the global south, a critical best democratic countries within BRICS. And so I don't think that there is a universal sense, and what needs to be done is to separate out the very kind of heavy MAGA Republicans, even from your liberal Republicans, and certainly to try and make sure that the hawks in the Democrats are separated from the mainstream of the Democrats. That's the kind of diplomatic work that needs to be done, and it doesn't only have to be done with Congress members and senators. It has to be done with the think tanks, the business associations, the churches, because that's South Africa's constituency in the USA.
Yes, and we'll get to what work needs to be done in the USA in a moment. But as you say, the committee chairman, Brian Mast, said that the country's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice is further proof of worsening relations between South Africa and the US. Who is Congressman Ronnie Jackson, though? I mean, does he have any links to Apex? And if so, why does that matter?
I'm not too sure that there are many who have not links with APAC. I'm not sure that you can find too many who have not been funded by APAC. And so without making APAC the big bogeyman, I think its influence is very definitive. I think APAC is the third circle within three supremacisms that I think is emerging. They've been egged on by our own ex-white supremacists from South Africa in the so-called Afrikaner, so-called refugee community. They've spoken into the MAGA where Ronnie Jackson comes from, and I think that they are being aided and abetted and influenced by that third wheel of supremacism, Zionist supremacism, that APAC represents in the USA. And so South Africa is up against a tough task. I think the US can't feel that heavily against China when they are dependent on China. So that's not the big case. We've assured them that it was South Africa, amongst others, that stopped the de-dollarization resolution. That's not going to be enough for them. And certainly, I think that even Trump has warmed up to Russia and Vladimir Putin. And so that is not one of the main issues.
So, and isn't that interesting? Because what the bill is trying to direct is for the US government to reevaluate these diplomatic, trade and military ties with South Africa, citing Pretoria's recent engagements with global powers such as Russia, China and Iran. But as you say, the US itself can engage with these world powers and we can't?
I think I go back to what Nelson Mandela said to the USA right at the beginning of his presidency. Don't tell us who our friends are when you were our enemies during apartheid and you were friends of the apartheid government. I think it comes very much to the same situation that we need to reiterate, but we also say that now, knowing our relative dependence economically on the United States, we're dealing with the fallout of our dependence on health funding and social funding and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, I think we need to be able to say that this is double standards, this is hypocrisy. You can't cozy up to Putin, you can't do a deal with China and then tell us where to get off, and you can't be warned by Iran that your base in Qatar will be bombed and you don't want us to have any ties with Iran. And so I think we are dealing with a geopolitics of absolute hypocrisy. I think therefore that I come back to the point that got me into trouble in the first point. I can't understand any rationality for what is going on in the US except a supremacist drive that dislikes the very idea of South Africa of being a non-racial democracy.
Yeah, and if you call it out, of course, then that becomes something else. If you really point out these contradictions. Here's the question, though. Where is the South African government in all of this? I mean, there appears to be a strategic communications vacuum here. The people that are controlling the narrative in the US are the ones who want this bill to be passed. I mean, someone in DC was telling me earlier today that South Africa is nowhere to be seen in DC. Even when embassies had open days, there was not much activity at the South African embassy. Isn't this a crucial time for us to have someone on the ground there, given this development and, of course, the tariffs that are coming our way in August? I mean, where's Mcebisi Jonas?
I'm not sure what the status is of Special Envoy Mcebisi Jonas, but I do want to say that I believe that there was a deliberate attempt to denude South Africa of a voice in Washington, of a presence in Washington, of making the kind of inroads where you speak to think tanks every week, to church groups every Sunday, in order to speak to business associations regularly, and to get through the doors of Congress and Senate and turn the narrative around. We have a compelling case. We have a convincing case against a flimsy argument from the USA, and I suspect that is why they don't want a diplomatic presence in the USA from South Africa. And certainly, I think that South Africa needs to speak to its natural constituency in the USA, which is the generation that grew up supporting us during the worst years of apartheid. That's what they are afraid of, that we actually have a constituency in the USA.
How should our government respond then? I mean, there are those who argue that just give up. Nothing we do or say will convince the US Republican lawmakers otherwise. So they argue that silence and us not saying much is actually a diplomatic message as well. But does that work for us?
I think the first step that our government should do is to meet with the representatives of the 600 US companies that are making profits here in South Africa and going through Africa, the automotive companies, the mine owners, all of them, plus the companies in the USA from South Africa that employs thousands of USAs like the Sasol workers in Louisiana. I think that's our first leverage. Our second leverage has to be let our critical minerals like platinum speak for themselves. Let's drive a bargain. You see, Trump does not respect weakness. He does not abide begging. But we need to show what are our strengths as we go forward. And thirdly, we need to be able to utilize our geopolitical, multipolar and multilateral forums that we are in. And so, for example, part of this whole pushback from the USA comes because we had a very successful BRICS meeting in which BRICS said that we need to be strong in the trade war that the United States has started. Those are the leverages that we must be able to use so that we don't capitulate or surrender, but we also don't be cavalier about what we need from the United States.
Yeah, I mean, after that successful BRICS meeting, Trump came up and threatened us with a 10% additional tariff for our partnership and existence within the BRICS bloc. What is the U.S. criteria for sanctions, Mr. Rasool? I mean, they've lifted some sanctions since Trump's new administration. One that comes top of my mind is against Syria, for instance. Should this bill really go through the Senate, the House, the Senate, and then get on the desk of the president? Is this likely to be devastating? Should there be sanctions?
I think that we should be very nuanced about what sanctions the US is thinking of in terms of South Africa. You see, at first, AfriForum and Solidarity and others were just calling for a blanket punishment of South Africa. Kick us out of AGOA, kick us out of this. Until they realized, actually, that the owners of the farm that export fruit to the US are the very same white Afrikaners that they were saying were being victimized by a black government. Until they realized that the owners of the mines, the owners of the factories that export to the US are actually mostly white. And so they went back there in the time when I was still there at the end of February, beginning of March, and then said, listen, Trump administration, don't do the whole AGOA, don't do the whole sanctions. Actually, just sanction certain leaders the black leaders in South Africa in the government of national unity. So they've changed their idea. And so I think that what they are trying to do is to target certain black leaders in South Africa and subject them to sanctions, and through that, hopefully create a momentum that white parties get a greater influence in the government of national unity and certainly in the forthcoming elections.
Yeah. Ebrahim Rasool, former ambassador to the US, thank you so much for making time for us. Let's bring in now ANC National Spokesperson Mahlengi Bhengu-Motsiri, who joins us now via video link. Mahlengi, thank you so much for also joining this conversation. Good evening.
Good evening, Clement. Good evening.
Are you worried at all as the ANC about this bill that has now progressed from the committee to the House?
You know, I've been struggling with responding to this question about worry in the past 2 days, precisely because we are here dealing with a threat to national sovereignty that should be of concern and should be seriously noted. And I think the response from the side of the ANC will be that we are seriously noting the developments in the USA, and this, of course, not being the first. There has been a spate of things that even provoked the president seeking a conversation with President Trump. And we all know how that went. And so back to your question, it is less about worry, but more about let the world see things for what they are and for who they are in this context. There can be no justification whatsoever for a government, a country taking a decision to impose sanctions on the leaders of the African National Congress. Whatever you may think or say about the ANC still remains that liberation movement that led the freedom struggle to emancipate the people, working with the people of South Africa to emancipate them. And the next struggle is to ensure that there's full economic emancipation.
Yeah.
The ANC has always stood on the side of those that are oppressed elsewhere in the world. I talk here about Western Sahara, the Sahrawi people. I talk here about the campaigns, ceaseless campaigns to call for the lifting of the economic and other embargoes against Cuba by the same United States. I'm talking here about the genocide in Gaza that is perpetuated by the apartheid state of Israel that is strongly allied to the United States. And so if you were to trace the track record, performance record of the African National Congress, in as far as promoting that injunction in the Freedom Charter, whose 70 years anniversary we're celebrating, there shall be peace and friendship. And I would add, and solidarity.
Yeah.
We have remained true to that particular injunction.
And the US doesn't seem to be happy. I mean, speaking of friendship, doesn't seem to be happy with some of the relationships this government has with other countries. I mean, this bill directs the US government to reevaluate diplomatic, trade and military ties with South Africa. And they're citing the engagement South Africa has had with global powers like Russia, China, and they're mentioning Iran as well. As the ANC, does this make you change your position about the relations you have with these countries? Because what's surprising here is that the US can sit down and talk to Russia, they can sit down and talk to China, but we can't.
It's a case of a serious hypocrisy. It's a case of double standards. And I don't use those words lightly. They're quite measured, in fact, because I think it is worse than that. Have a look at the transactional relationship that President Trump has been having with countries since he assumed his current tenure. Have a look at the fact that South Africa has never made it unknown that we stand for multilateralism. We stand for a world where the playing fields are leveled in favor of poorer countries, countries in the global south that continue to try and recover from the ravages of colonialism. We've never been shied away from mentioning all of those things. We've never shied away from our leading role in the BRICS community of nations. We've never shied away from our position on the issue of Palestine. Hence, as a small country on the southern tip of Africa, took the matter to the International Court of Justice, a totally unprecedented step, and managed to do that because we believed in the moral high ground of that particular position, and also to be true to the expectations of our forebears. And so I do believe that all opinion makers and media individuals and colleagues, such as in your role, Clemens, really ought to be finding out from some of your colleagues, your peers, your opinion makers in the US, also about what are their stances, because the voices are very muted even in the US, but we are comforted in the fact that we continue to engage with some of our historic allies in the anti-apartheid movement.
But do we have any presence? Does our government have any presence in the US, Mahlengi? Because if you talk to people that are in DC, they're suggesting that the only prevailing narrative is this one from these lawmakers who are pushing all these agendas against South Africa, and one wonders if we are not on a back foot here. Like, for instance, Mcebisi Jonas, we don't know if he has been to the US yet. Is he there now? Who is talking on our behalf and representing our voice? There's a vacuum.
Well, I'd like to defer on that to government so that we also avoid the whole thing about the conflation of party and state. But I do wish to say that it is my belief, it is our belief as the ANC, that the Department of International Relations and Cooperation is hard at work working with counterparts at trade, industry and competition, including these matters that are being ventilated by President Trump in public. And yet there are negotiating teams that are working, as we know, and that is just a fact. Secondly, I do agree with you, though, that the ANC, together with other progressive formations in our country, must be intentional about confronting the right-wing extremism that we are seeing in our country that is now landed or is reinforced by its association, a newfound relationship with the United States of America. And if South Africans think these sanctions and this proposed bill by Ronnie Jackson, whose record, by the way, is a record of right-wing extremism. And I don't know, when I read up on the analysis, I don't get a sense that even our own opinion makers are having a sense of history where the individual is concerned, and those that support that very right-wing discourse that he is pushing, including utilizing parliamentary processes in the US Congress. But the reality of it is that where I agree with you is that there is going to be a need as part of the national dialogue conversation and many other conversations, including our diplomatic strategy towards the US. I'm certain that the president is sitting down with a team around the table to say, how do we respond in a typical South African fashion, though, measured manner, calm, matured, because we cannot afford to behave in the same way as our detractors seeking us to go into the level to which they wanting us to go to. We've got to look at the interest of the entire geopolitical environment. We've got to ensure that we don't get bullied, as the president has rightly said, because if we allow that, and part of what Comrade Ebrahim Rasool highlighted, we need to make sure that we continue to be steadfast in that same tone of Nelson Mandela, that you are not going to dictate to us who our friends should be.
If this bill passes through the House and Senate and the president signs it and some ANC leaders get targeted, as the African National Congress, would it be your position that our government should retaliate and sanction some leaders in the US?
I don't think that at this point we can even think of that kind of a tit-for-tat approach. I think we will have to look at a strategy and interventions that continue to understand that part of solidarity and part of diplomacy includes people-to-people diplomacy. And once you take positions of that nature, you're undermining the very essence of what are the cornerstones of our diplomatic policy and our foreign international relations and cooperation policy. The ANC will have to always rise, as we have risen above even under-vexing moments, including the case of so-called white genocide in South Africa, for the fact that our president sought to undertake a trip to go and make representations. There are very few men and women who will take a decision of that nature, but it is in our nature to consult and negotiate. I don't think that it would be for the ANC or anyone to even think about a tit-for-tat thing, because ultimately states are there, but ultimately there are people who must continue to interact with one another.
That's true. Mahlengi Bhengu-Motsiri, ANC National Spokesperson, thank you for making time for us. How one wishes that the same measured tone that we have taken throughout this entire time could be reciprocated by the United States. Let's look at your tweets that have come through. We've been asking you this question: how should South Africa respond to this proposed US bill that seeks to review bilateral relations and impose sanctions on South African officials? There's still a long way to go, but it is an important development that this bill has now progressed from committee to House. Bono says, let's pose our own counter sanctions and do our own bilateral relation review to show them that we are not dependent on them. Mokoni says South Africa should engage in diplomatic talks with the US to address concerns and clarity policies while also exploring ways to diversify its international partnerships. Tabiso says we should seek alternative markets such as BRICS and Africa. It's time to implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's been long overdue. The US can keep its market that is being used as a weapon to dictate foreign policy of other countries. Well, the challenge also with us deciding to solidify our presence within the BRICS bloc is that somehow threatens the US President Donald Trump. As you will remember, when the president was in Brazil for that BRICS summit, the US president came out and said countries that are associating with BRICS will face an additional 10% tariff. So now we're being told who we must be friends with. Here are some of the WhatsApp voice notes that have come through.
Season of glory, greetings, Mr. Clement. We are indeed living in exciting times. Look, I think we should not give up. Let the government of South Africa continue in trying as much as they can to create relationships and resolve these issues. Remember, President Trump will be in the White House for a certain period. Then after that, what? Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, SABC and SABC viewers. You are speaking with David from Provincial at on my side, I think we should accept and acknowledge that the United States doesn't want any relationships anymore with us and move on. At least we do have our good allies such as Russia and China and other countries, so there is no need for us to beg for United States of America to be on our side. Thank you.
Sam Alekothrikopoulos Clement Dumel. US and South Africa have not historically been the best of friends. South Africa's decision to take Israel to the International Court of Justice seems to have tipped US frustration into outright retaliation. The best thing we can do as the country is to cut our umbilical from US. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for your inputs. After the break, we speak to the KwaZulu-Natal Premier about some allegations that have been leveled against some of the MECs in his cabinet. Stay with us here on Face the Nation. Welcome back. Two members of the KZN Provincial Executive Council are facing serious allegations of misconduct. Political parties in that province have accused the MEC for Education, Sipho Hlomuka, of interfering with tender processes for a school nutrition program to benefit his allies. The Health MEC, Nomagugu Simelane, is also accused of impropriety and corruption in connection with their family business dealings with the provincial government. The Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, Thamsanqa Ntuli, says he's addressing these allegations, and he joins us now. Premier, thank you for making time for us. Good evening.
Good evening, Clement, and to the viewers at home, and thank you for having me.
So we're talking here about political interference, personal enrichment, corruption. These are serious allegations aimed at not one, but two members of the Executive Council. How are you addressing them?
Indeed, there are serious allegations which require a prompt action. As a result, I've written to the two MECs so that they respond to the allegations. Then when I receive their responses, I will then take an appropriate action which will be informed by the responses and other information one may receive at a time.
Okay. So far, they haven't really given you the explanation, because from what I've seen, for instance, the MEC, Nomagugu Simelane, seems to have confirmed the existence of the company in question, but says it was actually somehow opened by her parents. However, she resigned from it in 2004. So there are questions around, even when you have resigned, about whether or not that company continued to benefit from state contracts. Have they said anything to you so far? Are you still awaiting their responses? And what becomes the next step once you've received those? Do you plan to institute your own investigation into these claims?
Absolutely, Clement. One did communicate with them on the receive of the allegations, inform them that I would be writing to them, because there are serious allegations in their nature, and they warrant that they are treated in a formal and official way, so that any action from after receiving the response will be informed by such a presentation. Well, in relation to whether they do know the companies that are cited, yes, they do know these companies that are cited. But what is important from their presentations is to understand the relationship between those companies in terms of the influence and in terms of the compliance with the prescripts of the law in terms of as they worked with or currently working with a government.
I see that there are some opposition parties in the province. They've written to you. They are calling on both Simelane and Hlomuka to resign, failing which they will file a formal removal request for them. They also want matters to be investigated further by the SIU and the public protector. Do you think at this stage you will be roping these institutions in, or it's too early?
No, it's quite too early, Clement. But what I can give as an assurance is that in terms of the appropriate action, I will take appropriate action as soon as I receive the report. But everyone is free to submit any information to any institution that is relevant to address any information. And it will be premature for me to say who I will also refer the matter, having not even seen their responses, because what is going to be a matter of interest is the laws of our country. Whether is there any wrongdoing which one will be able to identify.
All right, Premier Thamsanqa Ntuli, thank you so much for speaking to us on Face the Nation this evening. After the break, we wrap up the show with a chat with former Minister Roelf Meyer. Stay with us here on Face the Nation. Welcome back. We sit down this evening with former Minister and seasoned politician Roelf Meyer, who joins us to discuss just some of the things that have been happening in South Africa, some current affairs issues, and of course the role that it will be playing for the national dialogue in shaping the country's future. Thank you so much for making time for us, Mr. Meyer. Good evening.
Good evening.
I want us to start with the story that we're leading with today in the U.S., this U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act that could review U.S.-South Africa relations. It's now passed from and progressed from committee to the House. How concerning do you think this is? Because it reminds us again of this tension that exists between the U.S. and South Africa.
Yeah, it reminds me of where we were in the 1980s. You know, in the middle of the 1980s, we, as the then government, had to face sanctions against South Africa, against the apartheid government, for obvious reasons. That was even during Reagan times. And now it's the opposite direction. So I was saying to myself, you know, I think what we need to learn from this current situation is that the US is an important partner. We can't ignore them. We can't say they are not important in the lives of South Africans and of the South African government. So we have to work at restoring that relationship. I think it's very important, and I think maybe there is something of a blame going our way, and that is that we didn't pay enough attention to keeping that relationship going over a period of time, even pre this current administration's period. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we have to learn from this. But at the same time, I think we must also realize the vast majority of Americans do like this country, and it's probably a small minority that act in the way that this bill now pretends.
Yeah. Well, what do you think is the best way to react to things like this? Is there a balance that can be struck here between one, standing your ground so that you are not subjecting yourself to bullying, and of course allowing for diplomacy to resolve this?
I think it's on the one side to ensuring that you keep the dialogue, you know, also at interstate level going. In other words, keeping the relationship open, but at the same time standing your ground in terms of what we have to be firm about. I mean, South African government in general about our foreign policy have been very clear in terms of our constitutional basis from where we're coming, a rights-based approach. And we have to stand our ground in that regard. And that argument must go out to the world wherever it is under confrontation.
Yeah, speaking of DC and America, I think your name was mentioned as a possible candidate for ambassador at some point to the US. Have you ever given it thought? Did the president approach you?
Fortunately not. But the question, you know, of course, didn't come up, and therefore I didn't have to respond. What I would have reacted is a different case. I don't think somebody of my age should take on that responsibility at this stage, quite frankly. Like Ebrahim Rasool was just saying, you know, it's something that demands everyday, very hard work in DC to get to the different think tanks, to get to the lobby groups, to work the corridors of power, Capitol Hill, State Department, etc., etc. And that demands, I think, youthful energy.
So, and I suppose that's where the challenge is, because one of the things you realize about Washington, D.C. is that you have to work the think tanks.
Absolutely.
You have to be on the ground. You have to work the State Department. There's a lot of lobbying that happens there, and that's why it's sometimes concerning when we don't see a lot of action. It's almost like our voice doesn't exist there. And it's the prevailing voice is that of people who just want and have an agenda against this country. What do you make, though, of some of the groups that have gone to the US to have conversations, even with some officials there, about South Africa, because they've seemingly worked against the national interests of this country. And that links me to the national dialogue as well about how do we then become united as a nation so that we're not fragmented. We can disagree on things, but there can be a time where when our country is facing attacks, we are united.
I think a number of things come to mind immediately in terms of what you just said. We neglected our relationship with the US over a period of time. When Ebrahim Rasool was there the previous time as ambassador during Obama's presidency, he was very active, very successful. I can say because I worked frequently with him actually in DC at that stage. And then followed a period of almost 10 years or more where we didn't do much in keeping up that relationship and doing that lobby work on behalf of South Africa. So there's a vacuum. And this is the second point, is that some groups from South Africa have now gone out and pretended that they can speak on behalf of South Africans. Quite frankly, Afrikaner groups that went there are not speaking on behalf of me as an Afrikaner, let alone the rest of the nation. So it's distorting the picture as far as South Africa is concerned.
Yeah.
And that is the kind of thing that we have to correct, and it can only be corrected, quite frankly, from the side of government.
Yeah.
Because government has to speak on behalf of the nation. And we have to get an aggressive relationship building approach towards the US, I think, as soon as possible.
Yeah. What are your hopes for the national dialogue? The president has appointed you as the co-chair. You've been involved in dialogues before. How do you think this one is going to benefit us as a nation?
Maybe just one correction. I'm co-chair with Professor Maluleke as chairs of the Eminent Group.
Eminent Group, yeah.
So not of the whole national dialogue.
Yeah.
And in fact, there will be 4 layers, more or less. The Eminent Group, the Steering Committee, the Interministerial Committee of Government, and then, of course, the Secretariat. And we are just one facet or layer of this process. But if we talk about the national dialogue and what it needs to achieve, I think it's about getting South Africans from a bottom-up approach, in other words, citizen-led, to speak about what this country needs at this stage, after 30 years of democratic practice, of a constitution that we all can be proud of, but still a huge lot of unfulfilled promises, aspirations and ambitions contained in the Constitution. So from the point of view where I'm coming from, as somebody who was part of the process that led to the Constitution 30 years ago, I can say to myself today, we neglected that responsibility even at that stage, not asking the question, how are we going to implement and fulfill the aspirations of the Constitution? And unfortunately, over a period now of 3 decades, we have seen those unfulfilled promises, still biting us in terms of the frustrations that people have on the ground. People without water, electricity, etc., etc. You're reporting about that on a daily basis through the media. And those things have to be raised by the voices from the ground. And I think, therefore, the dialogue serves a purpose.
Yeah.
It has to be, of course, led and channeled in such a way that we come up with real challenged results. In other words, in a way that we can say, okay, these are the problems, but what are we going to do about it?
And I mean, a lot of South Africans are hoping that there will be implementation of whatever outcomes and recommendations come out of this, because you know yourself, we've got amazing policies here in this country, but implementation at some point becomes the problem and the bottlenecks there. What's your message to South Africans who are less hopeful about this process, who are thinking, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, we know what the problems are, and we know that this government is not going to be serious about implementing this. If they were, they would have implemented the policies that already exist.
It's like, I think, a type of a reset. What we have seen over this period, we're talking about the 3 decades since democracy. The result is that we have seen a less interest or a disinterest in the political affairs by voters not coming out and participating when they have the opportunity to do so. We've seen it last year in particular, where we had an election outcome of less than 50% in real terms. And all of that indicates to one thing, and that is there are huge frustrations with the representatives that in the past have been elected. So this, I think, it's an opportunity to reset. But it has to produce real outcomes. And the aspirations of this national dialogue are to ensure that, first of all, people can speak, let their voices speak, and secondly, to come out with clear visionary ideas about what we really want to achieve in the next period of time. And thirdly, then to produce a social compact. In other words, a new agreement almost between South Africans, through government, through political parties, through business, civil society, labor, etc. And if that social compact can actually bring together the aspirations of the nation and say, okay, this is what we want, this is how we can do it, and also, very importantly, put a time frame to that with a very clear implementation plan. Because I think that is part of the frustration. We've seen a national development plan, which is an excellent document, produced 15 years ago.
And we've missed every single target of that NDP.
That's the problem.
So, is there space at the dialogue to also reflect on how we got here? In other words, is there space for accountability? Because I believe that we need to discuss what brought us here to avoid repeating the same mistakes. And I'm not saying we must just pander about, you know, the party that has failed for 30 years or the policies that have failed, but I think there's an appreciation to understand how did we get here so that we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah, I think there's a wide range of things that we have to look at. I mean, Parliament is supposed to keep government accountable. But with the electoral system that we have, the proportional system that we have, which I'm not against and which the Constitution actually commands us to follow, it says a proportional system in broad terms should be followed. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is where lies the accountability. And because of the electoral system in its purest form that we have as a proportional system, there's a lack of accountability. So one of the things that maybe we should actually consider during this dialogue process is actually how do we adjust the electoral system to bring about real accountability for those that are getting elected.
Yeah, the politicians have not been fans of changing the electoral system because the State Capture Commission chairperson has recommended it, Van Zyl recommended it, Kgalema Motlanthe, I can go on and on. But Roelf Meyer, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Clement.
I really appreciate your time. And thanks to you for watching the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. We'll be back with you on Tuesday at 8 p.m. Have a good evening. Cheers.